Hi students, welcome to lesson number 20 on women's movement in pre-independent and post-independent India, part B. The period after India's independence is called post-colonial period. Immediately after independence, India had to deal with a variety of problems. Years of colonial domination had destroyed our indigenous crafts and depleted our natural resources. The lack of mobility, illiteracy and other factors like industrialization and changing technology made it difficult for women to adapt to the new order. The social reformers attempted to reshape Indian society at this time by enacting constitutional and legal protections for women and the general public as well as ensuring that all citizens are treated equally regardless of caste, creed, race, religion or sex. Telangana movement, Chipko movement and anti-Iraq movement are a few of the well-known movements of this period. And let us look at the Telangana movement led by the women. Initiated in 1946, the Telangana movement lasted until 1951. One of India's two main post-war insurrectionary peasant conflict is this one. People who demanded food and freedom from the repressive rule of the Nizam, the Patils and the Jagirdars in Hyderabad state protested during the Telangana movement, that is from 1946 to 1951. On the Nizam's private domain, the peasants were bound to the Sultan. Landlords took from peasants unlawful levies and forced labor under the Jagirdari system. In addition to this, the Deshmukhs and Deshpandes, that is the chief revenue officers of a district who gradually acquired land ownership or tax collectors of the Nizams, seized hundreds of acres of land and claimed it as their own. As a result, peasants became renters. The Vetti system, which enforced varied degrees of forced labor and exactions on all peasant sections, was one common social phenomena. Each family was required to send a representative to transport supplies, carry mail to neighboring villages, collect wood for fuel, etc. Landlords were required to provide free footwear, clothing, cookware and other household items. So, the practice of keeping peasant girls as slaves in the landlord homes was another prevalent arrangement. Landlords' daughters were frequently transported with their husband as concubines when they got married. The peasants started to rebel when the landlord's demands led to the eviction of the peasants from their land. 1946 saw the beginning of sporadic conflicts with the Deshmukhs of Visunar, Suryapet, Baba Sahebpet and Kalluru. Numerous women who were in difficult situation during their slavery, great poverty and sexual exploitation by feudal lords bravely participated in this movement. The Communist Party established a women's organization that issued a women's journal called Andhra Vanita in order to mobilize and foster political awareness among women. Through this, they advocated against widow remarriage, child marriage, higher pay and other issues. Women who made up a significant portion of the agricultural labor force and tobacco leaf pickers became militant in the fight for land, better pay, fair rent and acceptable interest on cash and grain loans after being severely affected by the oppression of landlords and moneylenders. Rape, taking concubines to the married daughters of landowners and other crimes were common among the bonded class, because the violence upper class women experienced was not publicized and structural parda was strictly obeyed by both high caste Hindu and Muslim women, and structural parda was a cover for upper class women's subjugation. Early widowhood and child marriage were prevalent, but women's education was unheard of. Muslim feudal rule's cultural hegemony in Telangana kept women out of society for a very long time. Women's education was added to the agenda of constitutional reform and civil liberties by Andhra Mahasabha, an organization that was founded to uphold the cultural identity of the people. As a result, a lot of women who were drawn to the cultural movements also become more involved with the Communist Party, which was operating through the Andhra women from all social strata, took part in the campaign with enthusiasm and dedication, and both the urban middle class and the peasant parts of the population gradually brought their support to the cause. The Communist Party seriously pursued issues relating to social reforms for women such as widow remarriage or the outlawing of child marriage and education for women and opportunities, also started to recognize women with the potential to strengthen the movement. Some of the women who took active part in the movement were Dubbala Salamma, C.H. Kamalamma, Regula Achamma, Chittyala Elamma, Pesaru Sattabama, Mallu Swarajam, Dayani Kausalya, Pramila Thayal, Chakkila Lalitamma, etc. The Chipko movement. Chipko movement was born in a small hilly village, Adwani in Tehri Ghairwal district of Uttar Pradesh. The illiterate Adivasi women led this movement in December 1972. It challenged the old belief that forests mean only timber and emphasized their roles in making soil, water and pure air as a basis of human life. This philosophy popularized the movement in many countries. The women symbolically tied sacred threads around the trees, faced police firing in February 1978 and later courted arrest. This movement continued under the leadership of Sri Sundarlal Bahuguna in various villages. The movement's plan is a slogan to plant fives, that is food, fodder, fuel, fiber and fertilizers, to make communities self-sufficient in all their basic needs. The Chipko movement is inimical to gender in its theoretical underpinnings as well as the political and economic ones. Women and children gather firewoods for domestic consumption. They rely on the forestry for combustible crop residues such as rice straw. This, however, is considered inferior to fuel wood. Therefore, forestry activities that increase the availability of fuel wood and development projects that promote improved stoves both release women's labor from fuel collection and permit its use in other productive activities, and improve the agricultural environment by permitting crop residues to be better used for enriching depleted soil. The movement points out the link between women's burden as food providers and gatherers and their militancy in protecting natural resources from violent devastation. The Chipko women believed that the trees were alive and could breathe like them. Thus, trees should be respected. Besides supporting agriculture and animal husbandry, the forest grew medicinal herbs used for healing powers. The hilly women used fruit, vegetables or roots from it in times of scarcity. This dependency on forest resources was institutionalized through some social and cultural mechanisms like religion, folklore and oral tradition. Many wooded areas bore marks of the hill folk's instinct for the plantation and preservation of the forest. The Chipko movement against tree felling is a phenomena no less. On April 1974, these women whose annual per capita income was rupees 129 rose against tree felling. It is nationally and internationally discussed as a people's ecological movement for the protection of the natural environment. Men migrated to the plains and women were left to cope with an impoverished existence and to provide for the old and the children. Women repeatedly challenged administrators and politicians stating planning without fodder, fuel and water is one-eyed planning. In the course of this movement, Garadwal women successfully undertook leadership roles and questioned the right of the men to decide the fate of the forest or to enter into contracts without consulting them, who were the worst affected. The forest was these women's home and hence they were not let it be cut down. The police force used all repressive and terrorizing methods to retreat the non-violent strength of the women. One of the women, that is Gauri Devi, led 27 village women to prevent the contractors and forest department personnel, about 60 men in all, from entering the rainy forest to cut 2,415 trees. While the women blocked the narrow passage leading to the forest, the men used all sorts of threats and also misbehaved with the women. But the women bravely refused to budge. In the course of this movement, Gherwal women successfully understood leadership roles and questioned the right of the men to decide the fate of the forest or to enter into the contracts without consulting them. Now, let us look at the anti-Iraq movement. One of the most important and significant activities of 1990s was the women's anti-Iraq movement in Andhra Pradesh. A major battle in Indian social history was fought by the ladies of Andhra Pradesh against the social evil of alcohol consumption. The consumption and sale of distilled alcohol are now prohibited in Andhra Pradesh, thanks in large part to the historical contributions of women. In fact, the campaign was not only about getting rid of alcohol, it was also about preserving their way of life and culture. The rural women in the village spoke out against the decline in the progress of their families due to the harm done to their children and themselves by their men. Dubbaguntu, a small village in Andhra Pradesh, Nellore district, is where the movement got its start. The successful literacy campaign that has been ongoing in the Nellore district was cited as a primary driver of the movement. The National Literacy Mission, that is NLM, was put into action beginning in January 1991 after being formally introduced in the Nellore district on January 2, 1990. With the realization of development as a tool for change and the empowerment of women, this program was implemented in a very creative manner. Therefore, a marketing strategy was created to convey the literacy message. A Center for People's Awareness was established, popular performances were utilized and primers were developed. Additionally, cultural committees were set up to use songs, dance dramas and street play to illustrate the significance of and necessity for literacy. Sharing of problems through such mediums helped women to create a close bonding. They decide to fight the vice of drinking. The women reasoned that if the Arak shops were closed, the men would not get liquor and hence would not drink. These women then marched together the next day and were able to get the Arak shop closed in their village. The Dubbagunta episode was soon quoted in another literacy primer under the title Adavalu Ekamaite, If Women Unite. The lesson had an electrifying impact on women in other villages who felt that they could do the same. In many villages, women's committees were formed. Their fight turned into a larger issue involving contractors, the excise department and the state itself. The women were curious as to why there were so many Arak stores but no running water, no children's schools or adequate pay in their community. Although the anti-Arak movement began as a spontaneous uprising of lower class and lower caste women, it quickly spread through classes and caste against local Arak shops, excise officers, liquor contractors and all of the state apparatuses involved in the trade. In addition to these, the women faced pressure tactics and assault from their adversaries. The women's struggle against the sale of Arak in Andhra Pradesh had 20 non-political organizations that fought for the scrapping of auctions and bring about a complete ban on its manufacture. Through this movement, women have definitely emerged out winners because they are well aware of their strengths and ability to bring about change in society. Most importantly, the anti-Iraq agitation is a very good example of the articulation of a family violence in public. It showed a feminist way of looking at issues, especially a private issue like family violence, and allying it to a larger issue of state and society. It questioned the notion about domestic violence being private and women not being able to do anything about it. This movement gave tremendous self-confidence and sense of power to women who realized their strength and used it to their benefit. Women emerged out winners because they were well aware of their strengths and ability to bring about change in society. Now, let us look at women's movement in India since the 1970s. The primary concern in the early decades following independence was for global economic expansion. An additional decade immediately after that saw a rise in concern for equity and the reduction of poverty. There were no initiatives specifically targeted at women, and gender issues were merged with those of poverty. The famine relief movement and other social movements of this time involved women, but it was not until the 1970s that they began to focus on issues related to their oppression. NGOs and other such organizations from the 70s started emphasizing on women's development and provided women avenues of collectively voicing their concerns. These grassroots organizations have questioned the welfare approach to women and incorporated an empowerment participatory approach. While questions about the success of these organizations are often raised, it is often seen that women exposed to some amount of mobilization show great potentialities, receptiveness and defining capacities. The groundbreaking towards equality report of 1974 demolished the idea of women's equality. It brought attention to the fact that despite numerous progressive social laws and constitutional protections, women's status had not significantly changed. The political, economic and social status of women remained inferior in many contexts. The report made note of the regrettable fact that society had not yet been successful in creating the necessary structures and norms to follow women to perform their varied roles. The prevalence of dowry practices was further rising, which further degraded women's position. The report also noted that after receiving a boost during the liberation movement, attention for women and their issues had waned over the previous 2 decades. The women's movement had focused on a wide range of issues in the post-independence era, including dowry, women's employment, price increases, land rights, political engagement of women, Dalit women's rights, rising fundamentalism, women's representation in the media, etc. Additionally, it has been successful in uniting many women around the 3 key themes of gender violence, globalization and girl child. Following are some of the key traits of the third phase of women's movement, which ran from the post-independence era to 1985. The women's movement experienced some passivity or accommodation up until the 1970s as a result of the socio-economic conditions in independent India. During the International Women's Decade, that is from 1975 to 1985, the autonomous women's movement emerged, with autonomous women's groups and organizations beginning to fight for liberation. The economic crisis of the 1960s created an environment in which issues pertaining to women are more prevalent and in which women started taking place. A number of laws, including the Hindu Marriage Act, Hindu Succession Act, Dowry Prohibition Act and Equal Remuneration Act, were passed at the beginning of the 1950s. The shape of the Indian women movement was also influenced by the development of independent India as a welfare state. The government Central Social Welfare Board advocates for services that benefit women, children and less fortunate groups in society. It has a nationwide grant in an aid program for welfare activities with a focus on the welfare of women. Since the late 1960s, there has been an economic crisis and stagnation, as well as price increase and increase in landlessness and widespread unhappiness in both urban and rural areas. In response to the economic crisis, the left-leaning parties organized movements. Women were mobilized in great numbers and took part in the general struggle of the rural poor, tribal people and industrial working class, despite the fact that women's issues were not addressed. Women's organization took up the subject of rising costs for necessities, adulteration, etc., such as Shramik Mahila Sangathan. Thus, impoverished women were being enmeshed in serious movements in the early 1970s, while wealthy women's organizations were hosting cultural events and beauty pageants. The autonomous women's movement came into being throughout the decade from 1975 to 1985. The designation of 1975 as International Women's Year later expanded to a decade took place. The Committee on the Status of Indian Women was established by the government in 1971 to evaluate the rights and status of Indian women and to recommend specific actions that would allow women to fulfill their legitimate roles in the development of the country. The general discrimination against women in the workplace, particularly in agriculture, plantation and other sectors, includes paying women less for doing the same amount of work. There are no working women's hostels, legal services or union rights for women. Due to malnutrition, the mortality rate for women is higher than for men. Dowry killings, wife beatings, mass rapes during caste and community rights, gang rapes, sexual harassment of women and stereotypical portrayals of women in the media are all examples of violence against women. The conditions of Dalit and tribal women, many of whom are forced into prostitution, are also impacted by poverty and deprivation. During the International Women's Decade, autonomous women's movement arose, which gave women's issue a chance to receive attention. The first International Women's Day was observed on March 8 in 1975. The fact that women organized and led the movements while fighting against oppression, exploitation, injustice and discrimination are significant aspects of women's autonomous movement. 6 categories could be used to categorize the women's organizations that appear during the autonomous women period. They are: the first one, autonomous organizations whose primary message is on agitation and raising awareness. Second, mass based or grassroots organizations such as trade unions, agricultural laborers organization, democratic groups, tribal organization, etc., where issues affecting women such as beatings by husbands and landlords and male drunkennesses have been addressed. Third, organizations that focus on helping needy women by offering them services, shelter and other things. Fourth, professional women's organizations such as those for doctors, lawyers and other professionals that work to combat prejudice and frequently open up new avenues for professional involvement. Fifth, political party fronts or wings for women. Sixth, organizations that do and document study on women issues. And these, the above mentioned groups and organizations, take up women's problems and its members are mostly women and they are run by women. Saheli, Manushi, Stri Shakti, Stri Mukti Sangathana, Panuramai, Iyakam, etc. are some known women's organizations. All these groups have taken up various issues like atrocities against women and they distribute flyers, gather petition, signatures in support of demands, plan protest gatherings, hold demonstration to sway public opinion, etc. Additionally, they plan street corner gatherings, play music, skits and poster displays. They publish feminism periodicals as well to educate women. By taking down the billboards and stopping shows where women have been portrayed or utilized as sex symbols, the autonomous action exposed the judiciary dialogue in like the Mathura rape case, in addition to raising awareness among women. To summarize, The concern for women's freedom in India was first expressed by enlightened men during the British rule, who had ingested liberal concepts unlike the women's movement in America and Britain. Men continued the struggle up to the 1920s. Only until Mahatma Gandhi entered politics did the nationalist movement he led change from a middle class movement to a popular movement in which women for the first time spoke out against the disadvantages they endured. The lengthy struggle for women's advancement from subordination to gender equality and finally to women's empowerment has been driven by the women's movement in India. Even though there is still much to be done and many barriers stand in the way of many more women having access to this reality, the women's movement has elevated and increased awareness of women's issues. Thank you.